And we are live. Welcome to Olivia's Stories, ladies and gentlemen.
Picture me as a young girl with long hair but an average face growing up in a poor abusive family. My family was the absolute worst. They never did anything to take care of me and my siblings. There were times we would go for days without eating. This obviously caused a lot of issues in my life growing up and even now. I was insecure and depressed. I was also bullied as a kid, so I was more of a loner than others. I didn't have many friends, not until my brothers came along. Their names are Jamie and Drew. They were my best and closest friends, and they still are. They would practically follow me everywhere and defend me from anybody that tried to hurt me. Growing up, I honestly thought it was something that I or my brothers did that made our parents dislike us and never take good care of us. But now I realize that some people are just horrible parents. Each person develops a maternal or paternal instinct and love for their child, but that instinct skipped my parents. It's not as if I'm trying to justify what I did, no. I know what I did was wrong, and no excuse will justify my disgusting actions. I regret what I did, and I hope that I might find some semblance of peace or something by posting on here. I'm married now, and my life was going great until I cheated on my husband and broke my family. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this, and you don't understand. So I'll start from the beginning. My name is Angela, and I am a 30-year-old woman, married to my husband Steve, a 32-year-old man. We've been married for 3 years now. We don't have any kids yet, but we were planning on having some soon. I want to tell you my story. I'm not a writer, so pardon me if there's any mistakes, but I'll make sure you'll understand what I'm telling you. This is my story, and I hope that by sharing it here, I'll not only find some respite, but also some people might learn one or two things from it and not make the same mistake I did. But first, let me explain so you understand. I'll start from the beginning of my married life. I met my husband when I was 21 years old in college. 9 years later, and I still remember that day like it was yesterday. I stepped into the busy college library. The air always smelled like old books, and everyone was engrossed in their studies. I was on a mission to find a philosophy book for an assignment, navigating through the tight bookshelves. As I reached for the philosophy book I needed, I accidentally touched another person's hand. Surprised, I looked up to see a guy with warm brown eyes. "Sorry," he said, smiling awkwardly, both of us letting go of the book at the same time. "No problem," I replied, nervously laughing. It was Steve, a fellow freshman. Our eyes met, and there was this weird connection. We started chatting about our classes, favorite books, and of course, the confusing world of philosophy. The library, usually a quiet place for solo study, turned into the backdrop for something more. Our talks expanded beyond textbooks, and soon we were exploring life's complexities together. What was once a silent place filled with the rustling of pages now echoed with our laughter and shared thoughts. Our chance encounters became deliberate meetings. We'd intentionally choose the same spot in the library, our corner of shared musings. We soon found ourselves inseparable, discussing dreams, fears, and everything in between amid the library's book-filled aisles. On our first date, Steve nervously suggested grabbing coffee, and I thought, why not? We picked a cozy local cafe for our first date. We sat across from each other. The place smelled like fresh coffee, and people chatted around us. Steve always had a friendly smile on his face. He started sharing stories about his family and growing up, and trying to make me feel comfortable. We chatted about everything, from our favorite movies to embarrassing moments. It was easygoing, and I could feel that our connection wasn't just about deep talks in the library, but instead, it ran deep. After coffee, Steve suggested we take a walk in the nearby park. Under the streetlights, we strolled and talked about our dreams. We found a bench, and that's when Steve admitted he played the guitar. I had noticed that he brought a guitar with him, and so I suspected even before he told me that he played. Curious, so I encouraged him to show off his skills. He pulled out his guitar, and suddenly, the park turned into our own little concert. After that, our relationship only grew more over the years. And a few years later, Steve and I decided we were ready to tie the knot. Our journey together had been filled with laughs, shared moments, and lots of love. We both felt that saying "I do" was the next natural step for us. After introducing each other to our families, it was clear that they were totally on board with our decision. They didn't just approve, they were excited to welcome us officially into each other's families. When it came to planning our wedding, we wanted something simple but meaningful. We found a cozy venue with an outdoor vibe for our small guest list of close friends and family. As we dove into the wedding prep, we worked together on everything, from choosing the food to creating a playlist that reflected our journey. We added personal touches, like a photo display of our college days and songs that meant something to us. The excitement built up as we thought about our vows, promises that really meant something to us. Invitations went out, and as the big day got closer, we were a mix of nervous and super excited. On our wedding day, we were surrounded by our favorite people. We exchanged our vows under twinkling lights and greenery. There were tears, laughter, and so much love. Our parents, who had seen us go from college sweethearts to this big day, were there cheering us on. To be honest, I hadn't even wanted to invite my parents, but Steve had made me as he said it was an important day in our lives, and no matter what, they would always be my parents. Either way, the celebration continued with dancing, toasts, and moments we'll remember forever. Looking around at our friends and family, it hit us that this day wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who had supported and shaped our love. After that, things only got better for us. My husband, Steve, and I lived in this 3-bedroom apartment which he bought, and I was really proud of him. After graduating from college, Steve eventually went through all the hurdles of medical school and then graduated and became a doctor, though I can't say where for the sake of privacy. I, on the other hand, became a part-time teacher. My days off on the weekdays were Tuesdays and Thursdays, while I worked every Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. From someone who came from a very poor home, I would say this was a huge achievement for both of us, and I loved it. We were earning well and making very good money. The only issue we had were kids. Steve wanted kids, and I did too, but Steve felt like we weren't ready yet because he felt I had some issues I needed to work through. Growing up in an abusive and difficult home with my siblings had undoubtedly left its mark, but I believed I was fine and that therapy wouldn't really help. I had this skepticism about therapy, thinking it might be a bit of a scam, a money-making scheme exploiting people's problems. It's a common skepticism, but sometimes it's based on misunderstandings about what therapy really does. Life was tough for me growing up, and I knew it had left me with some issues that I never really dealt with. Steve, being caring and perceptive, noticed how my past could mess with our plans for the future. He wasn't being critical, he just wanted us to be rock solid before bringing kids into the mix. I was stubborn about getting professional help, thinking I could handle my problems on my own. Therapy felt like admitting defeat or saying I couldn't deal with my own baggage. Deep down, I kept telling myself I was fine and that therapy wouldn't do anything for me. But maybe that was just my way of avoiding the tough stuff. However, I really wanted kids. I had sworn to myself that I would never let my kids be treated the way I was treated, and that I would give them all the love, affection, and kindness in the world. That was never given to me or my siblings by my parents. In fact, I was desperate to have kids. I loved kids, but Steve would not relent until I had gone to therapy, so I decided to go just to get him off my back. Steve was so excited when I told him I finally wanted to go. In fact, he was there with me when I booked an appointment with the therapist, and the therapist was even recommended by Steve. I was to see the therapist on my next day off, which was a Thursday. On that day, I got dressed and left the house. Like I've said earlier, Steve was a doctor and he had to be on call and available regardless of if he was at work or not. That meant he was always busy, though he tried his best to make time for us. As I stepped outside to get to my car, my attention shifted unexpectedly to our new neighbor. A young guy, probably in his early 20s, caught my eye. He had this friendly, approachable vibe, and a genuine smile lit up his face. It was a refreshing sight. What really surprised me was his welcoming wave, and to my surprise, a playful wink accompanied it. I couldn't help but smile back, waving in return. It was a small yet sweet moment, a brief interruption from the thoughts swirling in my head. Leaving for therapy with that friendly exchange fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but feel a bit lighter. My neighbor was very handsome, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was single or not, or what if I was married to him and not Steve. Stupid, I know, but back there in my head it was just harmless fantasizing, or so I thought. Honestly, I walked into therapy with a mix of hope and nerves, thinking it might help me untangle the mess of my past. But the whole thing turned out to be a letdown. The therapist seemed more interested in assuming things about me than actually listening. Every time I tried to share something, they'd interrupt or jump to conclusions, like they had my whole life story figured out before I even said a word. It felt like they had a script in their head and were just going through the motions. As the frustration built up, I couldn't take it anymore. My hope for a helpful therapy session turned into anger, and I let out a few curse words, expressing just how fed up I was. Storming out of that office, I felt a mix of anger and disappointment. Leaving therapy, I started to wonder if it was even worth it. This experience made me question whether seeking help was the right move. It was a tough moment, realizing that not every therapist is a good fit. I knew I needed someone who would really listen, someone who respected my perspective, and that therapist was not it. I decided to talk to Steve about my therapy experience. I had already made up my mind that I couldn't continue with it. However, when I got home and shared my feelings, Steve's reaction caught me off guard. He refused to believe my frustration, twisting my words and making it seem like I was overreacting. According to him, storming out was unnecessary, and he suggested I should control my temper and give the therapist another chance. Frustrated and angry, I chose to keep quiet, knowing that arguing with Steve wouldn't lead anywhere positive. It felt like he wanted me to explode just so he could say he was right and reinforce his claim that I had anger issues. Internally fuming, I restrained myself from saying more. Despite my reservations, I reluctantly agreed to another therapy session to appease Steve. Unfortunately, the second round turned out to be even worse. The therapist continued assuming things and insisted I had anger issues, making me feel even more horrible. Unable to contain my frustration, I cursed at them and stormed out once again. Feeling disheartened, I came to the realization that maybe therapy wasn't the right path for me. The experience had left me feeling misunderstood and invalidated. I decided to take matters into my own hands, determined to deal with my issues on my terms and at my pace, even if it meant going through the process alone. After the disastrous therapy session, I was seriously ticked off as I stomped my way home, still no sign of Steve. My anger was pretty obvious. I slammed my car door and straight up ignored our new neighbor's friendly hello as I made a beeline for my front door. The therapy mess was still hanging over me, making everything feel extra bitter. Just as I was about to reach my front door, our persistent new neighbor, picking up on my anger, hollered at me. He surprised me by being kinda nice and a little flirty, suggesting that talking about what was bugging me might help. I tried to blow him off, but he wasn't having it. He kept at it, trying to chat me up and even pulled off some funny magic tricks that actually made me crack a smile. Feeling a bit weirded out, but also weirdly comforted, I figured there was no harm in ditching my plans to sulk alone at home, especially since Steve was still MIA and not yet back from work. Giving in, I headed back to Derek's place, my new neighbor. As we kept talking, I found out more about him. Turns out his name was Derek, and he lived solo. Derek's persistence and friendly vibe helped shift my focus, at least for a bit, from the mess of frustration and anger that had been hanging over me. Back at Derek's place, I couldn't help but notice that his house was bigger and way better furnished than ours. My curiosity got the best of me, and I asked him straight up how he could afford all this. Turns out he was a trust fund kid. That made sense, as I had also previously noticed he had a cool car. Derek continued being a great host, keeping the vibe light and making me laugh. We discovered we had similar tastes in movies and books, sparking a few friendly arguments along the way. Derek even dared to boldly claim that the Hunger Games movies were better than Harry Potter. I strongly disagreed and stood my ground. Chillin' at Derek's place turned out to be way better than I thought. We were just vibing, chatting, and his easygoing style started growing on me. The more we talked, the more I noticed these little things about him that just made me smile. So, Derek suggests we watch a movie, and I'm like, sure, why not? As we kicked back for the movie, I started feeling something more. It hit me that the laughter, our shared interests, and Derek's genuine niceness were making me see him in a different light. I was low-key catching feelings for Derek, and it caught me off guard. I was a married woman in my early 30s, and here I was flirting with someone I barely knew who was way younger than me. I barely knew him, and still, yet here I was feeling attracted and flirting with him. Maybe it was the temporary resentment and anger I was feeling at both Steve and the therapist, but I desperately wanted to punish and get back at Steve. It barely took time. A few minutes into the movie, and Derek and I were on each other. We both knew from the moment he invited me in, and I obliged that we were going somewhere and crossing boundaries we weren't supposed to cross. Derek and I got intimate, and I cheated on Steve. By the time we were done, a few hours had passed, but Steve still wasn't back. I was horrified at what I had done, and soon after I quickly left Derek's house and went back home. And honestly, in a few days I went through all the stages that a cheater went through. I first contemplated telling Steve, but quickly crossed that out as I knew he would never forgive me. I also lied to him about going to therapy, even though I had stormed out. I felt so guilty. I judged myself multiple times in my mind, and I even ignored Derek no matter how many times he tried to reach out to me. However, I was soon after it. I decided I would continue my affair with Derek. I would make sure Steve never found out by using therapy as an excuse. Instead of going to that horrible, judgmental, and assumptuous therapist, I decided I would just lie to Steve I was going and spend my time at Derek's. My plan was foolproof, or so I thought. I soon approached Derek and told him what I wanted. I wanted us to continue the affair. I told him I felt lonely as Steve barely had any time for me and basically downplayed Steve in his eyes. He agreed, of course, and soon we were having a secret affair. When Steve would think I was off to therapy on my off days, I would actually be at Derek's. I would wait for Steve to leave and head to work at the hospital before I would go to Derek's and spend the day with him. I started feeling and acting happier. Derek had a way of uplifting one's mood no matter how sad and angry you were. Steve noticed these changes in my mood, and he happily thought that it was therapy that was making me this happy. Steve would tease me about the day I said I would never go to therapy again after angrily coming home. He would ask me to compare the sad me on that day to the happy me of nowadays. He would comment on how happy he was that therapy had made me happier and that I should be grateful to him for pushing me to continue on to therapy. I would just smirk in my mind and agree with him. That continued on for a long time. Steve would think I was at therapy, but I would be at Derek's. On the fateful day my secret was finally exposed, everything went on as usual. I waited for Steve to leave the house and head to the hospital. I kissed his goodbye and watched his car leave the driveway. Then I dressed and headed out to Derek's. Then I proceeded to spend the day with him. We had fun like usual. We were intimate. Then we had breakfast and even lunch together and watched a bunch of movies. Steve had mentioned to me that he ordered something online and expected it to be delivered that day, so I decided to go to the house and check if the item had been delivered, as I hadn't really been watching out for it. However, before I even got to the house, I noticed that Steve was on our front porch, standing and staring at me. I knew he had seen me coming out of Derek's house. Deciding to play it cool, I walked up to him and tried to pretend and lie that Derek had recently bought an IKEA furniture that needed assembling, and that I had gone to help him with the assembling. However, it was pretty clear Steve didn't believe me. He just shook his head and walked inside the house. I continued trying to defend myself, but it was no use. I had been caught. Steve laid it into me. He was so angry, he couldn't even keep his words straight. He was stuttering. He asked me why I hadn't been going to therapy. I was shocked. I asked him how he had known, and he told me a few days earlier he had called the therapist to thank him for my improvement, and the therapist had been surprised and told him that I never went to another session after the two where I stormed out. Steve said he had wanted to confront me, but he had wondered where I always went if I didn't go to therapy, so he waited a few days to watch me, and now my secret was open. Steve was so heartbroken. He wondered what I had seen in the new Neighbor. I tried to beg him, but he refused to listen. He told me he was never getting over this betrayal and that we were done. He told me he wanted me out of his house before he came back and that he would make sure to inform everyone about what I had done. No amount of begging made him change his mind. I begged and cried and even knelt, but Steve was adamant. He wanted me out and he wanted a divorce. He then left, presumably to work. I was heartbroken. I had ruined my marriage with my own hands. I cried for hours on end before realizing that I had no choice but to park my stuff and leave, and also hope that Steve eventually forgave me and let me back into the house. I didn't want a divorce. I loved my husband, but there was nothing I could do as I was greatly at fault. I went over to Derek's and told him what happened. He said he had wondered where I went because I had told him I would only take a few minutes to check if the package had arrived. Derek also said that he had noticed Steve's car in the driveway and assumed I was waiting for him to leave first before coming back over. I honestly thought maybe Derek would take me in since Steve had kicked me out, but he vehemently refused. I was shocked. I thought he liked me. But Derek revealed I was just a means to an end and that he never liked me. He even laughed in my face and said he couldn't stay with a dishonest woman before kicking me out. I was stunned. My heart had been broken twice in one day, and worse of all, I had broken and destroyed my marriage, all for someone who saw me as a means to an end. Soon enough, my phone started buzzing, and everyone was calling. Steve's parents called, and when they saw I wouldn't pick, they sent me insulting texts about how I should be ashamed of myself. Even my parents called, but I refused to pick. I was already in low contact with this, so I was even surprised Steve had called them and told them what happened when he knew I didn't like talking to them. The only people's call I picked were my brothers. I was in tears as I explained to them what happened, and even though they were angry at first and even scolded me, they also gave me a 30-minute lecture about how what I had done was so wrong. But at the end of the day, I would always be family. They couldn't abandon me in my time of need, and so they came over immediately and helped me pack my stuff and took me to stay with one of them. I'm currently in my brother's house, and all I can say to you guys is I regret everything. Steve is still not in communication with me, and the only thing he has told me is that he will bring over divorce papers for me to sign. I have lost everything. I feel so angry at that therapist. I am in the process of lawyering up, and I've decided to ask my lawyer if I can sue the therapist for violating patient confidentiality by revealing to my husband that I wasn't coming to therapy, though my brothers think the therapist wasn't at fault. Well, that's the story of how I ruined my marriage for some fun. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you don't make the same mistakes I did.